It helps if I'm unmuted. That is my number one tip for any live stream, especially this one. Welcome to Life's a Breach, yet another episode. As you can already tell, we are live. So that means during the discussion, if you have any comments, if you have a question, drop it in the chat. We're actively monitoring that. We love it when it's interactive. It makes these conversations so much better. And today we're going to be looking at something very specific to builders. And, if you step back, the advantages of adopting a DevOps philosophy no longer really in debate. We're well past that. Teams want to move quick. They want to build more. They want to reduce their operational overhead. This led to a bunch of different advantages and new techniques and new tooling. Today's topic is the ubiquitous CI/CD pipeline. Well, maybe not ubiquitous and maybe not just the pipeline, but we're going to talk about the principles and the concepts behind CI/CD in general. So again, if you have comments and questions as we're going along here, drop them in the chat. Even if you're watching this on demand, we still always have great discussions around these posts, so don't be shy. Now, joining me today is Angel Rivera. He's a principal dev advocate for CircleCI, and he is an expert in CI/CD. Angel, welcome to the stream.
Hi, thanks, Mark. Glad to be here.
Yeah, I think this is going to be a really, really good chat. So let's start with maybe the easiest, but probably also one of the most frustrating areas for you. When most people think CI/CD, they kind of automatically start and then they finish with the pipeline. That's the entirety of it, right? Something to get code out of the repo and into production. Given that there's two paired acronyms there, right? We've got a CI and a CD. There's got to be more to it. Can you maybe fill us in on what we're actually talking about here and sort of the nuances?
Yeah, so right, CI/CD, which stands for continuous integration, and that's the CI piece. And the CD, the acronym, the other part of CI/CD, apparently has two different meanings, in the general sense. So it's widely accepted that the CD portion stands for either continuous deployment or continuous delivery. Now, I used to be in that camp as well until I kind of, years ago started figuring out, like, wait a minute, this doesn't smell right? Like, continuous delivery is basically a concept that can get you and your processes, right? You and your team and your processes to deliver software continuously. So for me, and I think the majority of folks who actually start implementing these practices and principles, continuous delivery is the overarching concept, right, of continually releasing your code changes. And CI/CD is a subsection or a method within continuous delivery, right? So the continuous integration piece revolves around collaboration amongst developers. So let's take all the tooling out of the picture, right? Like, forget about the CI/CD platforms that we use and the automations that we use to accomplish this stuff. Let's look at practices and principles, right? And I think then you'll start understanding a little bit better that the continuous integration is all about collaboration between developers versus just writing some script to automate all your processes, right? And same with continuous deployment. You have to kind of have principles and practices, right, that your team uses, or operating procedures, or whatever that may be, right, to get your software changes from A to B, which would be the ultimate release to your users, right? So yeah, continuous delivery is kind of, again, the overarching. So you'll hear me say that quite a bit, probably most of the time when we're talking about CI/CD. But yeah, it's all kind of mishmash, right? And it's an industry problem. We have this, right, with acronyms. And I think it's every industry, right? When you start using acronyms, and then people kind of pick and choose, right, whatever. And I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm just saying that, whatever works for you, that's fine. But in general, I think if you think about these concepts in that way, it's a lot easier for you to digest and then also understand, right?
Yeah, and I think so. I mean, I think you're totally spot on. I mean, coming from mainly a security background, we love our acronyms for some reason, and they, solve as many problems as they cause, which is, an
Yeah.
interesting thing of itself. But I love in your description there how, it's all people focused and it's about the goals, and, the technology is
Yeah.
sort of the last piece, which, based on my experience, is always the most productive way to approach it, as opposed to just, I want to use this cool new tool with no idea as to why or where. And a lot of a lot of the pieces you were talking about, I found really interesting around, that collaboration and that enabling that discussion, between teams. And I think, it's understandable for people who aren't in the midst of building something to kind of simplify CI/CD down just to the pipeline. But, you provided a description and an explanation that didn't even mention it, which I think, underlies the fact that there's a lot more here in this topic, than most people are aware. But just to satisfy folks, and just to kind of, give them the
Sure.
familiar point, let's take a minute to focus on what they're already familiar with, which is actually the pipeline. So what are the basics of a pipeline in your mind?
Right. So the basics of a pipeline are, and let's take apart, right? Like a pipeline, obviously, right, is if you look at it like a waterway or a gas line, right? It's literally intended to as a transport vehicle, right? Like so, it's taking, in the sense of a gas pipeline is taking fuel from one place to another, and usually it could be like maybe it's to a refinery, right? So materials are being maybe refined a little bit, and then some materials go one area for maybe to become petroleum, right, or gasoline, right, and the other
Mm-hmm.
materials are going to another refinery to become whatever, petroleum jelly or whatever, rubber or whatever it is. So think of a pipeline is kind of in that same format, but for your code, and you're actually not even your code, your changes. So like you could leverage a CI/CD pipeline to do things like uh, automate the checking of documents or validating stuff within documents, not only just code, right? We use it primarily in code, but I actually encourage people to kind of investigate, because what it is basically an automation, right? Like so the platform like CircleCI, you have others out there as well, but all we're doing is providing a controlled automation for you to accomplish the things that you do manually in an automated manner. So that brings brings consistency, reliability, and velocity, right? So like if you don't have to manually do XYZ, in your process. So your software development lifecycle processes, right? They dictate how and what you're building. Uh, your pipeline should match those processes, right? So meaning there's a test element, right? So pipelines are built basically, we call them jobs. So a job would be like unit test these code changes, right? That's one element. There could be a security element, right? So you can be like, hey, Lacework tool, check security, check these code changes, vulnerability scans, whatever it is that you need done. So every pipeline has it's built of elements of jobs, right? And you could have one that just does testing or security checks, and that's it. Packages it up, the packages up those changes in an artifact, and then now you have kind of a deployment artifact, right? And then if you want, or if you feel comfortable, then you can have a pipeline that can deploy that artifact to a specific target environment. It could be production or a QA a system, whatever, right? So at the end of the day, the pipeline is, again, it's just an automated way for developers, operators, whoever, to automate the manual things that they do, right? The redundant manual things, but they're super important, right? Like you need to test your software, you need to run security scans, but it's time consuming. And as
Mm-hmm.
developers, operators, whatever you're doing, context switching is really hard to do. But the main takeaway is the pipeline is a feedback loop, right?
Okay.
So that's the crux of it all. Is it's a feedback loop in the context of continuous integration, right? Where those practices and principles are all about, making a change to code, pushing those changes often and frequently to a shared repository that the rest of your team has insight into or visibility into, and then be able to kind of anticipate changes. So like if I'm working on code that maybe you and I are working on a project, I'm working on a piece of code, but you and I are going to touch the same pieces of code at some point. That's what I talk about, collaboration outside of the tool, right? I need to
Yep.
just have a conversation with you, Mark. I know that you're going to be touching stuff. I'm going to be touching stuff. Who goes first? And that's where
Yep.
developers lack, right? Like there's that communication, and
Yep.
then you create merge conflicts, right? And then it takes even longer to resolve. So my point is, with continuous integration, right, think of these pipelines as more than just like automation. It has to, you have to do these human interactions, right,
Hmm.
so that you can work more efficiently, and then your pipeline will be a lot more tied to or at least reflect your software development life cycles, right? So that's and we can get into that a little bit later about those kind of problems. But at the end of the day, that pipeline at the bare minimum is designed to just complete your work for you in an automated manner, so that you don't have to do it manually. And
Okay.
again,
Yeah.
with that, you get reliability, uh, 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 consistency, and then velocity, meaning things get done faster, right? And then you allow the developer, the human, to switch context, right, and work on something while this pipeline is going. And if
Hmm.
usually we get the happy path, right, everything's clean and green, you don't have to think about it again,
Yeah.
right?
Okay.
Unless someone raises a flag.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good way to look at it. I love that repeatability. I love that velocity. Maybe if I sum it up using a non-code example, just to see if I've got it right here. So if we were building, like if we were writing a document, and so you have the initial author, and you go, okay, I wrote this document, and you need to
Right.
check it over. Right. And so that is a process, and then after you've checked it, it's going to be formatted. And let's say it's going out two places. It's going to be formatted as like a PDF
Right.
and as HTML on the website. And that requires different things. And it's a repeatable thing that we need to know. So we need to
Right.
collaborate and figure out, okay, what are you going to review? What are you going to check? Like, what's that human element? But then once we figure that out, we drop it into a job in our pipeline. It sends it over to you. You check it out. It continues along as a job, and it gets formatted, as a PDF to go out this
Right.
side. It gets formatted as HTML to go up on the website. And here we've simplified things as opposed to us forgetting every fifth document. Like, oh crap, I forgot to make a
Yeah.
PDF out of that one, right?
Exactly.
And you can imagine that expanding out, where now you maybe translation gets added in. Maybe someday someone goes, hey,
Right.
we need these emails too, so you add that in, and you're getting all of these manual processes that people kind of keep up here out into something repeatable. And obviously that's way more complicated when we're dealing with code, because we're lucky if we only have to collaborate between the two of us. Normally there's our squad, and then squads and squads of developers working on this stuff, which actually brings me to the next question I wanted to bring, which is a bit more technical, but I think we're at the explanation point where it's possible. A lot of the time, conceptually, people coming to this think one pipeline, but I know teams have sort of an active debate of, should there be one pipeline or should we have multiple pipelines? And what are the determining factors as to which way we should be going?
Yeah. So to kind of set the conversation, we're talking about software development, right? So generally, and this is true for most projects or even CI/CD continuous delivery platforms out there today, you essentially have one pipeline, especially in the CircleCI kind of universe, right? The way we operate, let's say you have a code repository. So that's a source of a project, we call it, right? So that project now has a pipeline, right? And that pipeline can do whatever it is that you want it to do. Now within that pipeline, you would have what we call a workflow. So the workflow can be considered like, I guess, multiple pipelines, right? So
Okay.
within that one pipeline, a workflow is in our CircleCI platform is a grouping or a consolidation of jobs. So the workflow dictates. So you would define jobs, right? So you're going to write a job that tests code. and you can reuse that job in a workflow.
Oh, okay.
So now the workflow allows you to chain all these jobs elements right together. So you know what I mean? And then you would have multiple workflows. So like with your example of like, hey, we have this document that needs to be converted and exported into PDF, HTML, or whatever, right? Maybe even a graphic, right? Whatever. Then you would have different jobs, right? You could have one pipeline with one workflow and one job, or a couple jobs that do that, or you could have multiple workflows for different conditions. Meaning, one is a let's just use like a testing example. One is just kind of a developer testing centric, right? This workflow maybe will test the code, maybe we'll do some security scans, and then maybe just flag someone with the feedback loop, like, hey, this is it. Another workflow could do all of those things and alert security, QA, right, to maybe do some QA functionality to it, like, continue on. So when we're talking about, I just don't want people to get confused about like multiple pipelines in this context. All that means is you're just generally speaking, one repo has one configuration file, which is the pipeline definition, and then from within there you can do workflows that will control how these, or I call it orchestrating how your jobs will kind of interact with one another and when, right? So with multiple pipelines, so depending on what you're trying to do. Now, if we're talking about like two repos that maybe you have microservices distributed, then maybe we're talking about multiple pipelines, right? And then orchestrating how those things are kind of interacting in an automated manner, right? So those are really hard problems, and I would recommend that everyone not think of those things like so the I think most of the frustration that comes from teams that try to do multiple pipelines is they're trying to do too much in the beginning, right? So they'll start and try to do all the things against all of their microservice repositories, and that's a problem, right? I would say start with the critical, right? Like so start small. Actually, start with the non-critical, I meant to say, services, and build pipelines, to kind of see and design and see how your interactions are going to be. Because what happens is folks try to orchestrate all the things, and then like be more all inclusive, right? Like, so like they think this service, just because we wrote this configuration, all of our microservices can use it. That's not the case in most cases, right? It's literally customized interactions. So when you're thinking about like most of the time when you have these microservice kind of architectures, that's when this kind of like, I would say, inter repo orchestration of pipelines needs to occur, right? Or maybe it doesn't, right? Some people just assume, but so every case is different. But my point is, if you're going to tackle like a multiple pipeline scenario like that, right, I would suggest that you take a look at your start with your most inconsequential, less critical services, and then build those connections, the connections between the two pipelines. Now I can tell you that at CircleCI we just added a few months ago a new feature that we call dynamic configuration. So that enables you to run some really cool I'd say allow you to design and execute really interactive pipelines that can do a lot more than the standard configuration in one repo. But yeah, that's I don't want to get too deep in the weeds, but this is a very complicated problem, and my point is start small, use things, get yourself to learn what it is that you're doing, and don't try to do all the things, because that's the biggest like thing that will bite you. And frustrate you and make you not want to look at continuous delivery, or at least
Fair.
look at it. Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
And
super
so it
frustrating.
seems, yeah. And I mean, that was a really great answer, and I appreciate it. And there is a ton of nuance and challenge here. And it seems like you're being very polite about it. So I'll be the blunt person about it, is that, the number one thing at developers, and I get it, like, we like to nerd out on stuff. And automatically when you're building something out, you're like, I need to build this at like Google scale. And it's like, well,
Right.
you don't have
Yeah.
you don't have a customer yet, so wait. It'd be great to get there, but that is a solution designed for a completely different problem space. And it sounds like that's a similar thing for CI/CD, is that people come at and go like, I need to do all of these million different things, and it's like, let's just start with one. And you mentioned earlier, it's essentially a feedback loop. Why not take advantage of that, of putting one foot in front of the other, checking, taking the pulse. Did that work? Okay, great. Let's add a little bit more. Let's add a little bit more. And it seems like, the sort of the one or multiple is kind of a false question. It's really, what path does that code, like what checks need to happen to that code to
Right.
get where it wants to go? And then, there will be times where there will be efficiencies of getting them all through the same place. There will be times where it's more efficient to go different routes, but start with the basics. Take one step before you
Right.
try to plot out your next ultra marathon, and go forward. And I mean, that we see that in security all the time. We see that in
Yeah.
architecture. It's just a natural thing of like, ooh, look at what this could be, but it's
Well,
nothing today. So start with something.
I think a lot of it is also the origins of that kind of mentality comes from demos, right?
Mhm.
And that's again one of the biggest problems we have in this whole kind of DevOps space, continuous delivery space, is folks are all about just looking at the platform and the different platforms out there. And right, when you have a salesperson or a sales engineer showing you, right, all the cool features, which there's nothing wrong with that, but as a consumer, potential consumer, you should be looking at like, all right, I would recommend you look at, like I said earlier, how is this tool going to facilitate my SDLC? How is it going to bring all the collaboration and the work, the human elements of the work and the processes, right, that we do day in, day out? How is this going to reflect that? How is this tool going to reflect that interaction, that human interaction? That's it's just fluid. And my process is in these tools. And if you come from that mentality, then right off the bat, you're gonna be more capable of evaluating those tools
Mhm.
and see how well they fit your needs versus what you think you need. Does that make sense? So
Yeah.
it's like with any tool, right? Like with any automation, we're just bringing a certain level of, again, reliability, consistency to things, right? um and yeah, that's kind of like one of the things that I see folks kind of, they fall in love with the tool before they even know what, how what it is that it's facilitating for them, or the benefits they'll gain. If that makes
Mhm.
sense.
So yeah, find a tool that fits your desired process, not fit your process to the tool because you thought the tool was cool.
Right, because I have conversations all the time as a developer advocate, and some folks come to me and say, hey, look, we were using Jenkins or whatever, and we switched to CircleCI, but we're still having the same problems. And I hear this all the time. And then I go, so we have a conversation, and I start asking about their internal human processes, right? How are you
Mhm.
doing this? And then they start describing it. And then we start having a conversation back and forth. And then eventually the light bulb goes off, and they're like, oh, it's a human process. Like, exactly. Like, no matter what tool you use, if you know, your human software development practices are broken, you're just going to have the same problems in a different tool, right?
Yeah.
Or probably worse, depending on what it is. So that's, again, for folks, the biggest thing I can tell you, if you're getting into continuous delivery, is understand what it is, that continuous delivery actually is as a practice and a principle, and then how you can apply it to your teams and get them functioning as a culture, right?
Hmm.
in a certain manner. That's, again, it's always different for everyone. You know, I don't say this is wrong. I don't believe in best practices because, you know, everything is different for every
Yep.
team, and especially because you have that human element. So, you can't really say this tool will provide it. The tool will provide you whatever it is that you need, or the whatever it is to facilitate your processes. That's all that is, point blank.
Hmm.
But again, if you're blaming a tool for your inefficiencies as a developer working in or developers working in a collective, then it's a culture problem and not a tool problem. Sorry,
Yeah,
long-winded answer, but
no,
I can't
that's good,
stress
and
that enough.
I think that's really important. For me, it's the
Yeah.
reminder is always, the reason you didn't get the time in the 10K that you wanted wasn't your sneakers. It's because you never bothered to get off the couch and train, right? And so you
Right,
can buy the
right,
most expensive sneakers you want. They're not going to help.
right,
And that kind of ties to, what you just said ties to one question I want to ask you, because you've had these conversations, time and time again with people, and you've got this depth of experience, and you've got this long view of it. Is there a tip that you could give people, or a strategy to address those challenges, like that conversation? What's a good way to open up that conversation if I'm on a team going, I think we can adopt this, CI/CD mentality, but I know we need to look at our
right.
processes first. How do I start that conversation with my teammates?
Yeah, I think one of the best ways. I mean, I've been in this business for a long time, so in the tech business. So, you know, it, I think this is my kind of view of tech. It's 95% people, right? People skills.
Hmm.
The rest is technical. The 5% is technical. So, learning how to communicate with folks is super important. Like, I think it's the most underrated skill. So right. So once you can, respectfully and constructively talk to folks, the conversation should be about, hey, as wouldn't it be cool if we could, you know, uh, implement some processes, right? That's human related, and it's really hard to do because you have folks that are like, set, especially like with developers, they have hard core beliefs
Hmm.
in how things should be done, right? We all have our biases, but I think if you can show results, right? Maybe take some data from other teams that is publicly available. At CircleCI, we actually produce on an annual level, we call it the State of Software Delivery Report. And this year
Hmm.
it just got published, 2020. So if you guys want to check that out, um, it talks about how teams can be high performing, right? Like, and that kind of data is proven. We've been doing this for 10 years at CircleCI, and we have a lot of data about how teams perform on our platform, and that
Hmm.
we can see when like we have data on like when a build fails, right, for a team, and we can see how long it takes them to recover from that failure.
Yeah.
And in general, I think the mark is like a 10-minute recovery time, we call it, right? So that
Hmm.
means I made some changes. It failed in my CI/CD pipeline. I looked because the feedback loop, right? And then I
Hmm.
fixed it within 10 minutes of that failure,
That's not
which
bad.
is right. And then, yeah,
Yeah.
then they get happy path. So that's one angle, right, that you could leverage. The other bit would be, again, the consistency and reliability. So if you're trying to sell it, you have to sell it to a few people in your organization. Number one, the individuals that you work with, right? Because I think once you make that change culturally, right, and folks agree to operate in a certain way, then it's a little bit easier to you build consensus, a little bit easier to kind of tackle maybe the engineering managers or the next level of people that you need to shot callers that you need to convince, right? But I can tell you, engineering managers are all about efficiency, right? They're trying to get these releases down. So the argument is consistency and reliability within the code. Having some data there from different teams, or like CircleCI, we have that report, and you can
Mhm.
get those for free on the website. The other bit would be, talking about how the investments that your company is making, or the efficiencies that are going to be gained in releasing software, right? So we're all in this tech world where release cycles are shorter and shorter and shorter, or expected to
Mhm.
be shorter and shorter. That's another argument, right? Like, how can we meet these expectations? And you're not going to do it without automation, right? Like, there's
Mhm.
no way that you're going to gain any efficiencies without automation. So that's the other argument is, and it feels good, right? As a developer, like being on a team, hey, it used to take us a month to deliver changes. Now we're doing it twice a day. That's a cool story, right? For to be a part of and to tell. So,
Mhm.
there's those kind of things which actually, believe it or not, benefit the individual developer, because if you can recover from, write some code and in 10 minutes recover from a bug that was in there, in your pipeline, or in your code changes, then you're freed up to do the cool things you want to do, versus, like, waiting on something, right, to finish and tell you. That's why at CircleCI we're super big on velocity, like keeping our systems super scalable. We
Mhm.
have tons of focus on horsepower, meaning the executors, the place where your code is running. It's on a
Yep.
machine. We offer like huge amounts of compute power and nodes for those jobs, right? Because, like,
Yeah. You want to get them done.
security, data, especially like data type
Mhm.
organizations, they need that compute. So we have an executor for everyone, right?
Yep.
Sometimes you don't need all that horsepower, but at the end of the day, it's shortening those release cycles, um, and that's kind of another benefit or story you could tell, right? So if you're trying to
Mhm.
convince folks, but the biggest convincing is going to be about, like, changing your culture. That's always again, you're dealing with humans. Computers are easy, just tell it. Right, the
Fair.
human element is really hard to kind of get across, but
Yeah.
it's possible. I've done it, and trust me, I've worked with uh some really salty neckbeards in my time, and I got them convinced in some cases, so it's good.
Right on, right on. And thank you, Jeremy, in the audience, for dropping the link to the CircleCI report. I've read it; it's fantastic. I recommend everyone who's tuning into this checking the comments. Jeremy dropped that link, which is great. You can just click on it and read through. There's a ton of great insights in there. And so, it's interesting you mentioned the velocity improving, the developer experience, and feeling good about that, because if you think a couple of years ago, or for those of us who've been doing this a long time, quite a few years ago, that used to be you'd write code and 12 months later it got released to a customer, and eventually a bug found its way back to you. And now we're shortening that down to, I tried to release it and found out and fixed it within 10 minutes. It's awesome, right? And there's a huge security benefit there as well. I know a lot of security professionals are always like, oh, I don't know deploys. I love small evaluations of risk, as opposed to, here I changed 50 different things and deployed. I changed one thing and rolled it
Right.
out again. That's way easier to scope and scale if something goes wrong, right? And to figure out. So I think we covered the pitfalls for sure, as that lack of addressing the people and not getting that cultural side. But let me ask you, as a sort of a closing question here, if you could add one thing to every pipeline out there, just magically wave your wand and boom, everyone, this was in everybody's CI/CD philosophy or directly in their pipeline, what would that be? What is the one thing that everybody has to have, in your opinion?
Well, the one thing, this is difficult to answer because I want all the things. Like I said, don't have all the things, but right, like, that's just
Yeah.
how we go. I I would have to say the most important thing, or the one thing everyone should have within their pipeline, is definitely uh, 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 testing mechanisms, right? Like, so anytime you're running a pipeline, you're excuse me, unless you're deploying something, and even then you're still testing, but these pipelines are designed as to be tests of your changes. So yeah, I would say like incorporate any kind of unit testing, any kind of testing, functional testing, whatever, right? Whatever you're doing with the application or your suite of tests. But I will say this, add testing, right? That's huge. The other bit I'll add though is that be cognizant of when and what tests you're running at a certain point in time. And what I mean by that is, you can run a test, a unit test. Those are designed to be like smoke tests, right? Super fast, very small in scope, and they're testing a specific thing. Where I see a lot of folks get tripped up is if I'm a developer, my pipelines or my workflows in my pipeline should not be running the full exhaustive test every time I make a code change, right? Because remember, we're trying to increase velocity and free up the developer to do other things. And if you're running your whole regression tests and all that, some of them could take, 3 hours, not 3 hours. Some of them could take 3 hours.
Yep.
I've had that, but in general, probably like more like 45 minutes to an hour, right? And that's just a waste of time at that, or that's just a waste of resources at that point in time, if that makes sense, right? Like, so I'm the developer. I just made a change to a function. I just need to test those functions. Now, once that gets, I'm good and clean and green, then that will progress down to another segment of the pipeline that only involves maybe Q&A, right? Like, okay, so if I'm taking these changes and we're putting them kind of all together, right, into one kind of another branch that's maybe the release of that change, then right, QA is going to get their hands on it. Then at that point, right, the segment should be a QA segment in your pipeline, and that should be executed by those professionals who are or those subject matter experts that are responsible for that, which also leads to some ideas I have around the feedback loop, which is, and we kind of touched on it. Releases and deployments are two different things, and a lot of technical folks really don't understand that. A release is more about the business aspect of code changes, right? The product change. And then deployment is a subsection of that, or as a function of a release, right? So like you're just distributing those changes, a method to distribute those changes. And what I would like to see in the future is subject matter experts like data scientists and maybe compliance folks and security folks and even the business folks, right, that are in charge of those code changes, or at least the business side of the code changes, be involved in this whole continuous delivery pipeline. And the reason I say that is they are the experts in their domain, just like a developer knows how to write that code, right? How to package it up. The operators know how to get that stuff deployed. The security experts know about the security vulnerabilities and should and are the only ones to mitigate those, right? Whereas a developer, we care. Nobody wants to write insecure code, but we don't. A lot of times we don't have the authority to mitigate, right? Like we can make the changes, and it's good that the developers make the changes because they'll know how that will impact their code, right? So like if one vulnerability mitigation step is to upgrade a dependency library, right? Sometimes you can't because of backward breaking changes, deprecations, right? And the developer knows that, the security people don't. So at some point, these feedback, so including them, right, they can have that conversation again. And that's what I would like, or I think is the future of, and I know you didn't ask me that, but I'm just giving you my thoughts because I like to talk, like I told you. But the future is like being more inclusive, and then with platforms, we're going to be building features that will enable anyone and everyone who has a stake in the release process of software, right? To collaborate inside of these automations, right? Because I think that's the future, right? Like that's going to be really, really big in the next level, next generation of continuous delivery and release management, right? Software management. So again, test. Be careful how you test, and make sure it makes sense, when you're running tests. Because I like my pipelines to run, at least the jobs in my pipelines, to run less than 60 seconds, right? So the only way you're going to achieve that is by segmenting your work in an appropriate manner, right?
Yeah.
It
sounds like a smart that's it. That's it. But I mean, it sounds like a smart segmentation strategy is going to keep that job time fast, so that you preserve that feedback loop. Right. And I mean, for me, that really comes back to what you said, is that we're looking for efficiencies, we're looking for repeatability, and we're looking to take the burden off the developer so that they can focus on what they do best, which is solving problems. And if we sum up, that you touched on multiple times, which I think just highlights how important it is that these tools can help you get the best out of your process and out of your collaboration internally, but you need to focus on that and have it reflective. And I really I appreciate you going off on that tangent with the release versus deployment, because I think it's critical is to understand that if you're doing, especially from a security perspective, if you're doing a release, there's a bunch of activities that need to happen that don't necessarily have to happen at every single deployment, because things won't have changed. So if you're talking about keeping that feedback loop short, you want to optimize each of those processes. And I think that's a critical distinction. And not enough people are practicing that or aware of that. So I really appreciate you highlighting that for us, Angel. And thank you for joining us today on Life's a Breach. I've learned a ton. This has been a fantastic conversation. Hopefully the audience has gotten a ton of it. As a reminder to the audience, we do stream regularly here on LinkedIn. So be sure to follow Lacework to get notifications when we go live. If you have ideas of topics that we should be covering, or other guests and experts like Angel that we should be bringing on and having a chat with, so that we can learn from them and the hard-fought lessons that they know, let us know in the comments. This show only gets better when we get involved. And with that, thank you very much for tuning into the stream. Thank you again, Angel, and we'll see you all on the next one.
Thanks.